Genre: Folktale. Blancaflor by Almaflor Ada. Illustrated by Beatriz Vidal. Essential question: when has a plan helped you accomplish a task? Read about how Blancaflor's plan helps a prince. A young prince had gone riding very early in the morning, before the sunrise. Now tired and sad, he sat under the branches of a large oak tree. He was thinking about his father, the king, who lay in the castle, sick with an illness no one knew how to cure. Physicians had been called in from all the neighboring kingdoms. Wizards had been consulted, and the queen had prepared with her own hands all the herbal medicines suggested. But nothing seemed to help the king, who grew weaker and weaker with each passing day. The young prince had been sitting under the tree for a while, lost in thought, when he was surprised by a deep voice that seemed to come from the branches of the oak tree. "What would you be willing to give for your father's health?" The prince looked around, but could see no one. "I would give anything and everything for my father's health," he responded, trying to disguise the fear in his voice. "Then in 3 years' time you shall bring yourself to me, to the 3 silver towers in the land of no return. Do I have your promise?" The deep voice bellowed as every leaf of the oak tree quivered. "Yes," agreed the young man. "I, Prince Alfonso, do solemnly promise that I will do as you ask if my father is indeed cured." "3 years from today," said the voice so loudly that all of the leaves fell, cascading down upon the startled prince. Shaking them off his shoulders, he jumped on his horse and back to the palace and to his father's room. "Son!" his mother greeted him with a smile, the first he had seen on her loving face in many days. "Look at your father. He seems so much better." And indeed, the sleeping king seemed to have regained all his color, and his sleep was sound and placid. The king was completely healthy again in no time. But now the queen worried about her son. He seemed delighted, as was everyone, to see the kind king recover. And yet once in a while the queen detected a profound sadness in her son's eyes. The king was determined that Prince Alfonso should marry. His prolonged illness had left him with a renewed urgency for life. "I want to see you start a family. I want to get to know my grandchildren." Even though the prince insisted that he was not ready for marriage, the king ordered portraits of every marriageable princess brought in from all the neighboring kingdoms. When they all failed to interest the prince, the king organized banquets, dances, and outings to have the prince meet every noble girl he could possibly invite. But while the king managed to create a great deal of work for the seamstresses and coiffeurs of the kingdom, and while many young people had a wonderful time at the events, he could not get the prince to change his mind. As time passed, the prince's behavior became stranger and stranger. He spent most of his time outside of the castle, riding his horse. During the evening, he wrote poems and composed sweet, sad music on his lute. Finally, one morning, exactly 1 month before 3 years had gone by from the day on which he had heard the mysterious voice, he set out on his journey. He left behind a stack of poems that talked about his love for his mother, his gratitude toward his father, and his joy in everyone and everything. He also left a letter for his parents, asking forgiveness for causing them sorrow, but assuring them that he was leaving only because he needed to honor a promise. The king could not understand the disappearance of his son. He was ready to send his knights and guards to comb the world until they found him. But the queen requested that he honor his son's wishes, just as his son was honoring his promise. Inside her mother's heart, she sensed a connection between her husband's healing and her son's departure. Young Prince Alfonso rode for many days, eating sparingly of the food he had taken with him. Several times he asked shepherds he met along the way for directions to the land of no return. They always pointed in the same direction, toward the setting sun. And when they wondered, why should anyone want to go there? The prince would respond, to honor my word. On the 7th day of his journey, the prince saw a white dove, who seemed to signal him to follow her, and so he did. But after many hours of following the dove, he found himself facing a deep ravine. He stopped, puzzled, knowing well that he could not cross the gorge on horseback or on foot. Then a majestic eagle appeared in front of him and looked piercingly into his eyes. "Might you carry me to the other side?" he asked the eagle. "Only if you give me your chain," the eagle responded. Young Alfonso took off the heavy gold chain that bore the eagle emblem of his kingdom and hung it around the eagle's neck. "It is only fitting," the prince said. "I have carried your image with me always. Now it should be yours." Then the eagle grasped him firmly by his leather belt and flew across the ravine. The eagle released the young prince on the other side, where the land was deserted and barren. Basalt and obsidian rocks burned hot under the fierce sun. Far in the distance, high above the steep walls, 3 towers of silver glittered. Alfonso had just taken a few steps toward the towers when he was stopped by a thundering voice. "Who dares step on my land?" "I am here to honor my promise," the young prince answered. "That is as it should be," the voice replied. "And to reward you, I will give you an opportunity to win your life back. If you fulfill the 3 tasks that I ask of you, you will stay here and marry one of my 3 daughters. But if you do not complete the tasks, you will be food for my hounds." Alfonso took a deep breath. Squaring his shoulders and steadying his voice, he asked, "What would you like me to do?" "Take this sack of wheat, walk up to the valley, plant it, harvest it, and mill it. With the flour, bake some bread and bring it to me tomorrow by 11 o'clock in the morning." To Alfonso's great surprise, a small sack of wheat appeared before his eyes. The young man lifted the sack and began to walk up the path among the rocks. What else could he do? His head hung low and his shoulders drooped, because he knew there was no way he could fulfill his task. But he had not walked far when a young girl appeared in front of him. "What's wrong?" she asked him. "Why are you so sad?" "I have been asked to do an impossible task, and my life depends on it." "My father must be up to one of his tricks," she responded. "But do not worry. I will help you. Take this stick and poke the earth with it. Keep walking on a straight line and poke as you walk. I will drop the seeds and all will be well." That afternoon, after all the wheat had been planted, they watched the sunset together. The young girl said, "My name is Blancaflor, and if you trust me, we will save your life. Now I have to go, otherwise they will miss me at dinner." After she left, Alfonso went to sleep, resting his back against a large boulder. In the morning the valley was covered with ripe wheat, its golden spikes shining under the early sun. Alfonso was still rubbing his eyes when Blancaflor appeared. "It's time to harvest the grain, mill it, and bake bread with the flour," she said. And as she spoke, the wheat flew out of its stalks and formed a golden mountain. A mill and an outdoor oven appeared next to the mountain of wheat. "Keep fetching wood for the oven," Blancaflor told Alfonso. And while he did, the mill ground the wheat, and loaf upon loaf of bread dough appeared ready to be baked. When the smell of the recently baked bread filled the valley, Blancaflor disappeared. "It's better that my father doesn't find me here when he comes for his bread," she told Alfonso before leaving. Soon a thundering voice was heard. Either you are a wizard, or you have met Blancaflor. Alfonso kept silent. Well, you still have 2 more tasks, shouted the voice. Better get started. Plant these grapevines and have the wine ready for me by 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. And while the loaves of bread moved through the air, as if carried by giant hands, Alfonso found 100 grapevine saplings at his feet. It was not long before Blancaflor appeared again. And just as the pair had grown the wheat the previous day, now they planted the saplings. That evening, as they watched the sunset, Alfonso told Blancaflor about his mother and father and the promise he had made. And once again she asked him to trust her. The next morning the valley was covered by fully grown grapevines, loaded with ripe bunches of grapes. And it took only a few words from Blancaflor for the grapes to be harvested and crushed, and for the wine to be stored in huge oak casks. Just before 11, after Blancaflor had already departed, the thundering voice was heard again. Either you are a mighty wizard, or you have been talking to Blancaflor. Alfonso remained silent, but he shivered when he heard the voice laugh. Well, let's see how you do with your last task. You need to bring back the ring my great-great-grandmother lost in the ocean. And if you do not have it here by 11 o'clock tomorrow, you will be food for my hounds. When Blancaflor returned, there were tears in Alfonso's eyes. I'm not afraid to die, but I hate to break my mother's heart. This task will be impossible, he told her. No, it won't be, but you will need to trust me even more, she replied. Blancaflor led Alfonso to a set of high cliffs next to the ocean. There the prince spotted the eagle, who had carried him across the gorge. The eagle will take us to the middle of the ocean, and then you must let go of me, and let me fall in, Blancaflor instructed. But I will not be able to do that, he argued. Yes, you will. You must, insisted Blancaflor. When they were high above the ocean, Blancaflor asked the prince to let her go, but at the last minute he held on desperately to her hand. As her fingers slipped from his, he heard a crack. Her little finger hung broken. Alfonso felt his heart stop as he saw Blancaflor disappear under the water. His eyes filled with tears as the eagle flapped her wings. Before he knew it, he was standing in the meadow next to the boulder against which he had slept the last 2 nights. There, on top of the boulder, was an extraordinary ring in the shape of a dragon, with 2 emeralds for eyes. He had not admired the ring for very long before he heard the thundering voice. So you found the ring. Either you are the king of all wizards, or you have been helped by Blancaflor. Alfonso remained silent. The voice continued. Follow the path to the castle. Tonight you will meet my 3 daughters, and choose one for your wife. When Alfonso reached the 3 silver towers, the gates were open. He entered, and in the main banquet hall there were 3 white doves. Choose one, right now, the voice echoed against the thick walls. Alfonso studied the 3 doves. They looked identical, but he noticed that one had what looked like a broken wing. He remembered Blancaflor's little finger, hanging twisted from her hand. I choose this one, he said, and walked toward the dove with the broken wing. Suddenly, Blancaflor stood in front of him, surrounded by her sisters, who looked just like her. No one would have been able to tell them apart. But when Alfonso observed Blancaflor's hand, he could see that one of her little fingers had been bandaged. Take your wife, ordered the voice, and let's all go to sleep now. We will celebrate the wedding tomorrow. Blancaflor guided Alfonso to her bedroom. Once inside, she closed the door and whispered to him, "They will kill us tonight. We must escape." She arranged the covers on the bed to look as if they were both sleeping. She blew on the glass of water next to her bed and led Alfonso outside. "I will stay here on guard in case my father comes in pursuit. You go to the stables to fetch a horse and bring it here. But mind you, there are 2 horses there. One is young and strong. His name is Viento, which means wind. The other one is old and thin. His name is Pensamiento, which means thought. Make sure you do not take Viento. Take Pensamiento." But when Alfonso got to the stable and saw the 2 horses, he thought, "That old skinny horse will never be able to carry us both," and he proceeded to saddle Viento. While Alfonso was getting the horse, Blancaflor's father was at his daughter's door. He called softly to see if she was asleep. "Blancaflor," and the breath she had left on the water answered, "Yes, father. Do you need me?" After a few minutes he called again, "Blancaflor," and the breath repeated faintly, "Yes, father." But when he called again a third time, the breath only let out a sigh. He stormed into the room and quickly realized that neither Blancaflor nor the prince was there, and so he set out after them. Blancaflor was dismayed when Alfonso came to fetch her riding Viento, but seeing that her father was emerging from the castle, she jumped on the horse behind the prince and urged him to go on. They had galloped across the valley for only a few minutes when they heard Pensamiento carrying her father, catching up with them. "If only we had taken Pensamiento instead of Viento," said Blancaflor. "My father would never have been able to keep up with us." Then she took the comb that held her hair and threw it on the road behind them. The comb turned into a chain of steep mountains that blocked the way and allowed them to gain a little distance. But very soon they heard the sound of Pensamiento's hooves approaching again. Blancaflor took the gold pin that held her shawl and threw it on the road behind them. The gold pin turned into a desert of very hot sand, and that allowed them to gain a little distance. But soon they heard Pensamiento's hooves again. "If only we had taken Pensamiento instead of Viento," said Blancaflor. And she took her blue silk shawl and threw it on the road behind them. The blue silk shawl turned into a large sea with high waves covered with foam. Then Alfonso urged Viento, "Take on all my good thoughts, the thoughts of my mother's love, the thoughts of my father's kindness, my thoughts of love for Blancaflor. You can take these thoughts, Viento. Let them lighten your step." Spurred by Alfonso's thoughts, Viento became as fast as Pensamiento. Before they knew it, the prince and Blancaflor were at the doors of Alfonso's own castle, being greeted by his kind father and his loving mother, who held them both in one embrace. They were still holding one another when a terrible gust of wind began ripping the leaves off the trees, and they could see a black tornado approaching. Alfonso gathered all his courage and shouted into the wind, "My word has been honored. How about yours?" The wind blew even more wildly for a moment, but then it subsided, and they heard in the dying wind a deep voice that sounded as though it came from far away. "You have proven to be wise, my daughter. Now, be happy." And this is the story of Blancaflor. It began with threads of silver and ended with threads of gold, all woven for you in the story I told.